Hey there, and welcome to another video. Winter has arrived here in Canada, and to celebrate the wind being so cold that it hurts my face when I go outside, I decided to make an Animal Crossing winter theme diorama. Here's the DIY recipe plan for you. These are not very practical for crafting, so let me get my craft hands first. Much better. Let's get started. I like to start with the base because it will help determine the size of the rest of the diorama. Can I even call this a diorama? I feel like it's too simple. Anyways, I use a piece of foam cardboard and cut it into a circle. Then I'm gonna wrap it in cling film and secure everything in place with some tape. Then I'm gonna add aluminum foil to give it a bit of a dome shape. Nothing too extreme, but just enough to make it more complicated for myself. Then let's cover everything in polymer clay. Now let's remove the cling film and foam cardboard so that I can put my polymer clay pancake in the oven. And while that is baking, let's make the brick ball that goes all around the base. I use a thick foam carpet that I got from the dollar stores years ago and cut an 1.5 inch strip that is long enough to go all around my clay pancake. I carved some bricks into the foam with a sharp blade and a sculpting tool. I was actually surprised by how well this turned out. Once that was done, I glued the two ends together to form a circle. Then I glued the pancake onto the bricks. I also dabbed a bit of modeling paste to add more texture to the foam. I painted the pancake in many layers of light blue. And when that was dried, I used a white paint marker to draw little circles to make a snow pattern like the one in the game. I painted the foam in gray, and I also used different shades of gray to paint some bricks here and there. This is a jar of leftover inks I had on hand. I'm gonna use this to apply a dark wash all over the bricks. The wash will darken the indents and crevices made in the foam and will add a very nice contrast to the bricks. The wash was a bit too strong, so I went over it again with some paint. At this point, I also realized that I had painted the pancake a bit too dark, so I redid it in a lighter color. Let's move on to the ornament tree. I made a cone from watercolor paper, then traced some lines to indicate where the leaf and snow will go. To make the bottom of the cone, I'm gonna trace a circle and draw tiny flaps all around. This is where I'll attach the trunk later on. I'm gonna cut and bend all the flaps so that it fits perfectly at the bottom of the cone. Now I'm gonna paint everything in green. I'll also paint this extra piece of paper that I'll cut into strips to make the leaves. Once I have a bunch of these made, I'll glue the strips all around the tree. I found that these stick better if I cut them in smaller sections. I glued 2 rows of leaf, gave the glue some time to dry, then covered the tree in cling film. To make the snow, I'm gonna use Hearty super light clay. It's an air dry clay. I had never used it before, so I wasn't sure how well it was gonna work. The cling film will make it easy to take it off in case it fails without ruining the whole tree. It actually ended up working really well, and after sculpting the clay in the shape I wanted, I went over it with a bit of water to smooth out the clay. And while we're at it, let's make the second snow section before leaving it to dry for 24 hours. I peeled the dry clay from the cling film and then glued it to the tree. Then I added 2 more rows of leaves and glued the second section of snow. Let's add one last row of leaf, and this time I didn't even bother with the cling film, I just added the clay directly on top of the tree. To make the tree trunk, I covered an aluminum cylinder in polymer clay and made 6 little triangles for the roots. I placed them all around the cylinder and then blended the clay with a wooden tool. I added more clay to make the trunk a bit thicker and carved a few lines in the clay to make a bark texture. After the clay was baked, I drilled a hole in the middle so that I'll be able to pass the LED wires through it. Then I painted everything in brown. Remember this cone bottom? I'll cut some flaps in the middle of it to attach the tree trunk to the rest of the tree, like this. Can I say how impressed I am that this actually worked? Now let's add the LED lights. I poked some hole here and there with a needle tool and a blade. Then I'm gonna pass the light through the holes. The LED I had are white, but the lights on the ornament tree are actually multicolored. I pull out the lights to be able to tint them with colored ink, and it actually worked really well. Once the ink was dried, I pushed the lights back in. With our ornament tree done, let's make a snowboy. I know that since I'm Canadian, I have the unfair advantage of having made plenty of snowmen since childhood. So listen real good as I reveal my super secret snowman techniques. First, make a ball. Then make a slightly bigger ball. Then stick those two together. Poke 2 holes for the eyes. Make a tiny triangle nose. Then poke 6 holes to make a nice polite Canadian smile. Now let's fill the holes with clay. And here we have a nice little snowboy. Let's paint him real quick. Now, all that is left to make is the villagers. I chose Sherb and Filbert. My sister has Sherb as a villager on her island, and I have Filbert on mine. So it was easy to get screenshots to make a reference sheet. To make Sherb, I started with an armature wire, then covered it in foil and added clay. I added more clay to build up the head shape. I also decided to cut off, hold on a minute, to cut off the arm wires. I made 2 horns that I'll stick on both sides of the head, and made 2 ears that I'll also stick on both sides of the head. Since this is a winter diorama, let's give Sherb a little sweater so he doesn't get cold. I'm wrapping the body in a thin piece of clay and will trim the excess clay off. I'll add a little trim at the bottom of his sweater and carve little lines in it. I made 2 cylinders for the arms and I'll attach them to the body. Once the arms are in place, I'll attach his tiny hooves to his tiny arms. I'll also add a thin strip of clay to make the cuff of the sleeve. The legs are also 2 cylinders. To attach them to the body, I'll gently slide them up the armature wire. Let's add a little tiny tail before throwing Sherb in the oven. At this point, I realized I had forgotten to carve out the mouth, so I added a very thin layer of clay and then carve out his little smile. And while we're at it, let's add his toupee. and his little tiny nose. We're done sculpting Sherb. Let's move on to Filbert. Let's start with an armature and foil. Be careful with the armature wire because I stabbed myself twice trying to bend the tail armature, but I'll live. So let's move on and cover everything in clay. I gave my fingers a break to heal and came back the next day to smooth out the clay. I made 2 symmetrical ears that I'll stick on the top of the head. I'll make his sweater in the same way I did it for Sherb. I added 2 tiny arms and 2 tiny legs. Let's bulk up the tail with foil and then cover it in clay. I also forgot to carve out the mouth for Filbert, so let's add a thin layer of clay. While we're at it, let's add his nose. And then let's carve out the mouth. I covered the clay in cling film. This will help to carve a nice and clean line in the clay. Let's throw Filbert in the oven and move on to painting. First, let's paint the base colors on. I made a sort of stencil for his face by tracing the outline of his face onto a piece of masking tape. I cut out the shapes and traced them on the figure with a pencil. This worked out so well, it almost feels like I'm cheating, but you know what? Work smarter, not harder. I made another stencil for the little tree on Filbert's sweater. After peeling the tape, I cleaned up the edges with a little bit of paint. Let's paint Filbert's face features. I always want to say Gilbert for some reason. For the cheeks, I use a pink Posca pen and then painted the swirls on his tail. The last step is to paint the pupils. That's one blue friend down, let's paint the other one. Painting thin and straight line is not a skill I have mastered. So let's not screw this up. Well, the nice thing about acrylic paint is that you can go over the part you screwed up. I started painting the pattern on his sweater, which is the default sweater in the game, before deciding that I had neither the fine motor skills nor the patience to do it. So I decided to try making this argyle sweater instead, before deciding that I didn't like the yellow. So I took a break. So while I do that, maybe now would be a good time to give this video a like, or even consider subscribing. Back to the sweater. I scratched all the paint off and repainted it in gray to make this tight-knit sweater. With all of our characters done, we just need to add one last detail to the base. I made a snow trim from air-dry clay and glued it all around the base and left it to dry for 24 hours. I passed all the LED lights through a hole I made in the base. That way I can hide the wires and easily access the battery pack. I don't even need to glue Filbert or Sherb, I can just slide them in the holes I made in the base and they will stick up by themselves. And last but not least, let's glue our happy little Snowboy. And now's the time for the beauty shots.